Hey everyone, thanks for coming. I'm really happy to be doing this. I tried to talk Pluralsight into letting me show you Fallout 4 for an hour, and that was shot down pretty quick. They decided that maybe talking about programming technology would be better. And so that's what we're going to be here for. What we're going to be talking about is ASP.NET 5. If you're on the call, you've probably heard about it by now. And we're not going to go through a lot of slides about what it is. I'm going to actually walk through and we're going to show you some code. And we're all developers here, and so I think that's probably the best way to get started. So the reality is that there are no slides. Let's go ahead and jump straight into Visual Studio, and we'll get started. So I've started with a brand new project in Visual Studio. If you're using ASP.NET 5, you're going to need to go to get.asp.net. Get.asp.net. That'll give you instructions on how to install the bits. I'm using Visual Studio, though you could be using Visual Studio Code on a PC, on a Mac, or even on a Linux box to be doing the same things. Now the way that Visual Studio Code works is going to be a little different from the full versions of Visual Studio. So you're going to want to sort of adjust that. In my course about the same topic, I briefly show you Visual Studio Code, but John Papa also has a great course on understanding Visual Studio Code that I suggest if that's the route you want to take a look at. But we're going to focus on Visual Studio. And all I've done up to this point, now I've actually walk you through this piece, and that is I've created a new project using the ASP.NET Web Application Template, which is the same way we've been creating ASP.NET applications for a long time. But in this case, there are these new ASP.NET 5 templates. ASP.NET 5 is a big departure from ASP.NET 4 and all the versions before that. It's a complete rewrite of the platform, and it's meant to be cross-platform so that you can run it on Mac and Linux boxes as well, and that development can be pretty much anywhere. This is trying to embrace open source and embrace the web. You're going to see the use of web technologies that are used all over in different spheres, in Node and in Ruby, on Rails, and some other places that is more embracing the web development community than it ever has before. And I've created one based on this just web application. This is a project template that has a bunch of the guts already in it. And if you've done this already, let me reopen this. I forgot I was going to close it. You can see that what it's loaded is a lot of code, and there's a lot of things that you may not be familiar with right off the bat, including Bower, which is hidden by default in RC1, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, Gulp, a package.json, a project.json. There's a lot of concepts that are different from the older version of ASP.NET that can be very daunting when you start to look at ASP.NET 5, since it is such a new platform. You're going to be able to use some of the same technologies, especially ASP.NET MVC that you've used before, but sort of the structure and the way it sits on disk is quite a bit different. And so instead of using this template, I'm going to use the empty project template. Let's go ahead and build up a small but ugly website using this technology so you can see how the moving pieces actually work. So here I have let me just close a couple of these, the empty project template. And both of this piece of code will be available after the demo, either through the Pluralsight website, or we may just put it up on my blog, but it'll be on one of those two places, my blog being wildermuth.com. And you can see that this empty project has a lot less pieces in it. And the two that it really creates at this point that are important are project.json and startup.cs. So project.json is essentially the configuration for your project. This includes different pieces about the application. In fact, I've gone ahead and opened it up here. It's a simple piece of JSON that configures some things like the version of your application, what dependencies it has, and these dependencies are just NuGet packages. And then there's some other pieces that I'm not going to belabor here because you don't need them right away. But so when we're looking at this project.json file, this is something that is meant to be editable by you. You could use the built-in visual tools will also edit this, and we'll show you some of those as we go on. But the purpose of the project.json is to describe information about your application, about how it starts up and those sorts of things, and is going to be something you're going to want to get familiar with. This is unlike a CS proj file or the new X proj file, in that those were never really meant for developers to actually work with. Let me talk about that. So here in dependencies, which is probably the place you're going to start with most often to add things, let's add a new line here and let's decide, hey, I'm going to need, let's say, AutoMapper, just as a NuGet package that is somewhat common in a lot of web projects. You notice as I'm typing, I'm getting IntelliSense for the different projects I could be trying to use. And these are actually going out and looking at NuGet and reading what packages match this. This is an alternative to just using the regular NuGet package manager. I actually like this because I'm a developer and editing directly in a text editor is sort of in my heart. Now, it doesn't mean that if you're more familiar and comfortable using the UI for managing NuGet packages, they will just end up here. So you can do it in both ways. Now that we've added the AutoMapper, it's gone out and looked at the different versions that exist. And I'm going to just go ahead and pick 404. And once I add this to my project.json and save, it's going to actually restore the packages. I don't know if this is going to show up too short for you to see, but there's a small yellow window that shows up in the Solution Explorer that says updating packages. So every time a change is made to the project.json, it adds that as a reference to our project. We can see that here in references that we now have AutoMapper as a dependency. So let's talk about this notion of frameworks down here, because it infers the references that are over here under the Reference tab as well. ASP.NET 5 embraces this idea of running against different versions of the framework. So DNX 451, which you'll see here, is really just running on top of .NET 451. In fact, some of this language may change as we get to the release early next year to where it may be a little clearer. But this is really running on Windows on a version of the .NET framework, the current version 451. The second set of frameworks you'll see here is DNX Core 5.0. .NET Core, as it's called, is the cross-platform version of the .NET framework. And this is missing a bunch of pieces that exist in .NET 4.5.1, and many of them are never going to be ported. So the WPF stack probably won't make it to Mac and PC. Certainly, probably not large portions of the WCF stack. You're going to see a lot of the infrastructure that may be already filled by the community missing from this cross-platform version. So you can kind of make that decision about how you're going to manage it. Which flavor of this .NET runtime are you going to actually use? The one on top of .NET 4.5.1 because you're hosting an IIS on a Windows box, or .NET Core if you're going to eventually want to run this on a Linux box in a VM somewhere in the cloud. And that's why we get these same references on both sides. So these references we see here are ones that are compatible with both .NET 4.5.1 as well as .NET Core, and so they ended up as references in both. In fact, it's been built twice, once against .NET 4.5.1 and then again under .NET Core, and so it's included both of those so that you can make the decision about how to run against either of these. We're just going to run under IIS on top of .NET 4.5.1 for our example. So you could play around with running on Core and running on a Linux machine and those sorts of things, and it actually does work. So we've now talked about dependencies. Let's talk about actual code. We're all developers here. And when we start a project, the literal startup of this project is just a class library, essentially. So the startup.cs includes a entry point, just like every library project out there. And unsurprisingly, it's actually just a void main. Main is started, there are some arguments, and all it does by default is tell web application, which is a class inside the hosting, to go ahead and run it using a class called startup that is in the startup CS. So this line of code is important to know that this is where it's all being kicked off. They're not hiding that from you any longer. This is actually new in the RC1. But this is saying go ahead and start up a web application and then start it up by using our class here. The purpose of the startup class is literally to do the startup. It's registering services and setting up middleware. It's doing all the wiring up of your application. This doesn't happen on every request. This happens as the server gets started up. So that as requests come in, they're going to be served by the runtime that's set up by the startup. Okay, we're doing time. Great. So we're going to get back to configure services in a minute. Let's just talk about this plain configure method. So these two methods have different purposes. Configure is how to configure the hosting, the waiting for a request. And the configure services is about setting up what services are going to be available to the entire system. So in configure, by default, it's doing two things. First, it's saying, hey, we may host this on IIS. We may not completely self-host this. So we're going to include the IIS platform handler. And this is a little piece of middleware that says, if I'm in IIS, let me make sure that things like Windows authentication works and basic authentication works and the other things that we're getting by sitting on top of IIS. You certainly don't have to opt in or use IIS, but this is there to sort of do that wire up, that accepting of those features. And then there's a simple piece of middleware that's in this empty project that just says, as a request comes in, I want to do something. And that's an important concept in ASP.NET of this idea of middleware. When you see how you're going to set up an application, you're going to see that you're probably not going to write that much of your own middleware in this run philosophy. The run philosophy says, I'm going to be called in a chain of things that are going to be called so that I can see when a request comes in. So let's talk about what's happening here. Because this run is here, any request that comes into our web server is going to call this asynchronous method here. It's going to go, hey, I have a request coming in, and what are you going to do about that request? And in this case, all I'm going to do is write out to the write back as a response, hello world. Let's go ahead and run this real quick. And I'm running this without debugging just so we can do it pretty quickly. So this request comes in and it returns hello world. In fact, if we look at the page source, it literally is just that text, hello world. It isn't an HTML page that has a hello world. We're literally sending back the entire stream of what the request is returning, and that is just a piece of text that says hello world. In fact, any request is right now going to return this. So if I do foobar, foobar is still going to return just hello world. And that's because our code here is not looking at any of the pieces about the request. It's just simply dumbly returning this response. You're not going to do this. You could go ahead and write some complicated middleware, do whatever you want. And the purpose of showing you this isn't to say this is how you write web applications, because it super isn't. It's to say that when you get down to the bottom level, you can simply plug in looking at the chain of requests and responses in order to do things. So you have full control. Library authors have full control. So there isn't all this cruft of making ASP.NET work. You're not having to dig into system web, which is now gone. You're not having to tie into extensions to IIS. You're given full control here, which is one of the reasons they're achieving better performance, but it also means that everything is pluggable. Everything we're going to show you, everything I'm going to show you over the next 20 minutes or so, is something you can opt in or out of. Nothing is required by default. So since we know that this is a bad way to develop web pages, let's talk about using MVC6 to develop it. So MVC6 is a maturation of the MVC you may already be using in ASP.NET. And in order to configure it, we do something similar to what we've done before, which is we can say app. We can opt into MVC by just saying app use MVC. Now this use MVC is giving us a squiggle line here, which hopefully has caught up with you now, because we don't have it in our project yet. MVC isn't part of that initial project that we created. It's another package, a NuGet package that we need to bring in. And so Visual Studio will help us with that by saying, hey, I know about use MVC. Do you want to add this package? Let's go ahead and add that package. We'll see the restoring again. And in fact, in Project JSON, it'll pop me over here, we can see that we're now adding MVC core as an assembly. So all that trick that we just looked at did was go ahead and add the NuGet package as a dependency in our Project JSON. That's all it did. And use MVC uses a pattern to configure MVC where you pass it in a lambda and then you can do things like map route. And the map route is that same structure you're used to, where you can just specify the name, the template, the defaults, the constraints. It's the same map. It's the same routing, but we're doing it in this pattern of configuring MVC when we actually use it. Instead of this, so you don't see me fumble around typing a correct route, there's actually a method here called MVC with default route. And default route is just that standard home index default route pre-wired. Most projects aren't going to actually use this. They're going to specify routes that make more sense. But for speed, I'm just going to go ahead and use the default route. Now, if we try to run our application at this point, this is actually going to fail because default route uses a number of pieces around MVC that don't exist yet. And the reason they don't exist is that by default, ASP.NET 5 requires that you use dependency injection. So when configure is called, it's looking at these list of parameters and saying, hey, how do I find an application builder to pass in here? Or when I'm asked to construct certain classes, how do I know what the required parameters in the constructor are and how do I pass those in? And that's where configure services comes in. Configure services is where you can go ahead and register individual or mass number of services that can be plugged into different parts of the system so that you're not tightly coupling them. If you've come to this webinar and you're not yet using dependency injection and you've been sort of dragging your feet on it, ASP.NET is pretty much going to force you to get comfortable with it. So let's talk about what that looks like. Because MVC in the configure is going to need some things, there's often going to be a pair here in configure services to say services.use MVC. Whoops, add MVC. So add MVC in the services is actually just adding all of those interfaces, all of those services that are going to be needed by MVC into this service collection, into this container for the different services to be distributed. Now, Microsoft ships with this default service implementation, but you can replace it with your favorite structure map or AutoFac or Ninject. it's also configurable and pluggable so that you don't have to depend on their dependency injection. Here we're getting the squiggle again because there's another package we need, and this is the full MVC package. In fact, the last one was just the core part of MVC, but because we're adding different services, we need to include the entire piece here. So now we're configured to go ahead and start listening for requests. We're at that point where requests should just work. So if you've done ASP.NET MVC before, all of this should look pretty familiar. I'm going to start by adding a folder called controllers. Now again, if you use the full template, all of this would have been built up for you. But I want you to see that there's no magic happening here. I'll just call a folder in their app, and I'm just going to create a new class called home controller. Let me get rid of that app folder because that adds some complexity that we don't care about. So home controller is just a class that derives from controller. Again, if you've done MVC before, this should be pretty solid ground that you're already comfortable with. And I'm going to go ahead and create a public method that returns an iActionResult. This is a little different from the old just action result. They've made an interface for it. And so typically I use iActionResult instead of where I would have used ActionResult in the older version of MVC. And I'll just say index because, again, if you've done this before, this should be pretty comfortable. So this part of the ASP.NET, the MVC part, is simply pretty comfortable. It's the same sort of behavior you're used to. So by coming into home index action, we're going to just return a view. Therefore, we need the folder, views, and then a folder under it called home. If you haven't done MVC yet and you've come here with ASP.NET Web Forms as the main way you've been doing ASP.NET, Web Forms isn't moving to this new platform. It's going to continue to get the kind of investments it's getting today, and it's going to continue to exist in ASP.NET 4 and below, but it's not coming to this new platform. There's just too many reasons that it's difficult to implement on multiple platforms. So they're really sticking with this new MVC model. And let's go ahead and create a view. We are still in the sort of beta RC phase, so some of the niceties like create the view while you're in the controller, some of that functionality doesn't exist yet. I suspect that's probably coming at some point. And then here we have a plain old index page where we can write some code like viewBag.title equals hello world. We'll start with just a plain old HTML page where we plug in the viewBag. Again, this is to mostly show you that the same sort of behavior. Razor is still there, MVC is still there. Most of that works in exactly the way you would expect. We now refresh this page. Going down to the root, we're going to see we're getting that same experience. We're getting hello world like we saw before, but we're actually getting this structure of an HTML page that we saw earlier. We're actually returning pages. This code is actually running. So let's prove this to you by changing the title to be and then let's include a paragraph tag. Right? We're actually getting this code directly from the server. So MVC exists pretty much in the same way it always has. You can use layout pages. You can use all those different pieces. See, we're doing it on time to see what all I can cover. If you've used ASP.NET Web API before, that's been merged into MVC. So we're now looking at pretty much the same ways of creating APIs as we are standard controllers. So let's go ahead and show you what that's like. I'm going to add a new class, and I'll call it our person controller. And there is no more API controller. There's some shims so you can reuse existing Web API code, but for the most part, these are just going to now be straight up regular controllers. They've merged the two ideas. Not all the ideas came over unscathed though, so if you're used to the sort of convention-based, it's going to be a little different than Web API was. It's functional, it's workable, you can it gives you the flexibility to do what you want, but you may have some pain points in coming from Web API to ASP.NET 5 just because some of the patterns are a little different. So let's go ahead and create another public method. And instead of iActionResult, I'm actually going to return a JSON result. There's a new result type that says I'm going to return some data that's going to be converted into some JSON for me. And I'm just going to call it get. I'm going to use that same convention that we saw in Web API. And let's just return. And we're going to use JSON as a wrapper to whatever objects in order to convert it to a JSON result. So here, I'll say new person. Let's return a collection. Don't worry about the squigglies. We're going to just generate the person in a minute. Hopefully by the time the video is caught up to my typing, all the typos have disappeared. Go ahead and generate that as a class. And so, of course, you'd find other ways of getting at all this data and returning an entity framework, whatever data source you want to use, but we're essentially just returning some data. Now, we could actually get at this by looking at the get, at the route of person as the controller name, but it would be expecting then this to be the index. So let's do that. Let's do person get. Let's see if it actually works. Ooh, it works. Well, that's kind of a lousy way to worry about it. And so the alternative is to actually use attributes. So I'm going to say get, and then I'm simply going to mix this with what the route is, API person, right? Because it's just going to be, when I say API person, it's going to issue this as only as a get. Because of course we probably want these all to be a little more API-like. So we're getting the API, the data the way we want. And of course, as soon as we add another method here, we start to get into magic strings and matching them here. You can still set up routes using that use MVC in the startup, or you can use this other approach, which is using attributes. And so I'm going to actually specify route here as API person, and then I just and specify this as an empty, so that later if I have a method that extends this, I could then say ID. Actually stub this out as just a new method so you guys can see what I'm talking about. If I have another method to get an individual version of this, how I end up with an extra, I can then just use that same routing syntax here to say this get route extends the route that I specified for the entire class. So if you've done attribute-based routing in Web API, this should be pretty familiar. The names are a tiny bit different to match the more MVC related HTTP post, get, put, etc. But they brought in the pattern of using routes at the class level as well as at the method level. And let's make this actually return a person. Assume it's going to return the right person. So we've got view pages, we've got the API working. Let's go back to these view pages for a minute. Let's see how we're doing on time. Okay, we have about 10 more minutes. So I want to introduce you to a couple more concepts here. First is, we come back to our page and we go to one that doesn't exist, like foobar. Out of the box, the experience of the error is actually empty. If we look at the errors we're getting here, a 404 is returned because it doesn't know about it, which is correct, but the body of that message for the 404 is nothing. And so for development especially, we're going to want to be able to opt into some of those error screens so we can see what's going on. And so just like what we talked about, none of this is enabled by default. We have to include all of this by default. So let's start with app use developer exception page. Now you probably only do this in a debug scenario, but for us, let's go ahead and just include that for a minute. And this is in another package, and so this is the opportunity to bring in the namespace as well as the new package for diagnostics. Because again, I'm going to continue to hammer on this idea. Everything is optional. They're trying to make the core package as small as possible so that people aren't using code in their web projects that they don't actually access. And I'll also add use, let's see if I can remember what it's called, use status code pages. Now, this exception page is for when an actual exception is handled. The status code pages are for when things like 404s happen. And there are ways you can make these prettier or make them create redirects to your MVC pages as well. I'm not going to go through either of those. I just want to show you that in order to get these exceptional cases, you're going to need to go ahead and opt into those. So now that we're getting a 404 here, it's showing the minimum amount, which is what the status code is not found. And there's some prettier ways to do this, but for now that's good enough. So let's go back to the CS HTML. I don't have quite enough time to create the layout page, but the whole layout system works the same way it did in old MVC. But what if we wanted to do something like add some CSS here, right? We want to be able to create a CSS page here to decorate what our page looks like. That's where this magic folder here called www.root comes in. www is the root of the web server. And so public packages, JavaScript, CSS, flat files, whatever you need to be able to serve as just files needs to exist in this www root. This www root essentially says this is where we're going to start the publicly accessible web page. And so let's go ahead and create a folder in there called CSS, or whatever you want to call it. You can call it styles, you can call it foobar, it doesn't matter. And let's go ahead and add a CSS page. And because I hate the name style sheet.css, let's go ahead and just call it site. And I'll just put something that we're going to be able to notice, like background color. Make it a little gray, and then font family. Just pick one of the pre-built ones that is a non-serif so we can tell the difference. And the whole dragging over onto our page, this simply works. What you'll notice is that the reference here with the squiggly is in reference to the root under www. So this CSS, the /CSS is resolving to www/CSS. Let's show our page, and ooh, nothing's changed. There's no gray, there's no font difference, and we're showing an error. And let's go ahead and look at net and refresh, and we can see that the error here is that it didn't find the site CSS. Well, I just talked you into that the www root was going to be the root part of the project, and it's not working. What did Shawn type wrong? Well, I didn't type anything wrong. The reason that doesn't work is that, to some people's surprise, even things like static files, use static files, these are also opt-in. So serving static files from your web server is yet another package and option you're going to configure. Now some of this can start to feel overwhelming. I have to opt into everything. If you start from the other project template, all of this is going to be turned on by default. So it's more about this learning opportunity to see how this actually works than worry about having to do this in every project. I would not start a brand new project this way. I would start from the other one and sort of edit and stuff. But I want you to see all the moving pieces. So if we now refresh, we're now getting that CSS, and so now we have the gray and sans serif font. So we can see that that part is actually working as well. And that would be the same for JavaScript and all of those pieces. With just a couple minutes left, I want to introduce you to one more piece. And this is one of the pieces that is a little bit confusing for new ASP.NET 5 developers, and that's the idea of client-side packaging. Now, a lot of web developers are already using this, especially outside of some of the core Microsoft developers, and that is managing packages. Now, there's a lot of different package managers out there, and most .NET developers are already familiar and comfortable with Bower as a package manager. Bringing in .NET packages feels comfortable. The world is sort of moving away from that for client-side packages. There's several different systems out there. There's JSPM, which is a package manager that's starting to get some steam. There's NPM, which is the Node package manager that is being used all over the place. And there's Bower, which is a client-side only package manager. Both Bower, the way that all of this stuff is plugged in, all of these are really possible and workable. In fact, in the default template, NPM Package Manager and Bower Package Manager are enabled and used in the standard ASP.NET 5 template in order to get things like jQuery and Bootstrap and things like that. Let me show you how that works. The first thing you're going to want, and again, the new template includes this file by default, but you're going to want what's called the Bower configuration file. It's just a file called bower.json. This bower.json is another JSON file where you're going to specify dependencies that you want. In fact, the pattern here is much like the project JSON, and that's because Project JSON sort of adopted that strategy from Node Package Manager, from Bower, from some other technologies out there. And the way you would use this is really the same. Let's look for jQuery, and then let it load. And it's reading these from Bower, the different versions of jQuery that we can get at. And I'm just going to get the stable version. And I'm using the tilde here to say, get this version. But if there's a newer version that is only differenced by the last minor version, you can get a newer version. That one's okay as well. And when we press save there, we'll see that there is a dependency on jQuery here that is fulfilled. And what happens is under www root, there's now a new lib folder that includes our jQuery library. Now, when you create a new project starting in RC1, this Bower JSON file exists, but is hidden. And the reason it's hidden is they have added a new UI, a new option here that say Manage Bower Packages. And so the Manage Bower Packages here allows you to have a similar UI to the NuGet Package Manager to do the same thing. So if I wanted to add, let's say, underscore, and install it, we can see that it went ahead and installed it by simply adding it here. And so depending on which pattern you're more comfortable, if you want to use the UI, use the UI. If you want to just type like I do, just go ahead and type like I do. It gives you both of those options. The only thing I'm not a big fan of with the way they've done this starting in the RC is that this Bower file is now hidden by default. So you're going to have to go show all files, and you'll be able to see it. And you can mark it as I can see it in the project. For the most part, any file you drop into the file system will show up. The bower.json as well as the npm JSON file, those are both hidden by default just to reduce some of that complexity for us. So if we come down here, we're going to get the same experience since it's just throwing it in www-root, but if we wanted to use it in our view, we can just do that same drag and drop we saw earlier. Let's put it at the bottom since that's always where I put my scripts. And we can see it has that same comfortable experience we've had before. The reason it shows up here in lib, just to complete this idea, is this extra file that's created called bower.rc, .bower.rc more specifically. And this is just configuration for Bower to say where to put this. If you wanted to rename this, if you wanted to move this, if you wanted to put this outside of www-root and then run some scripts to only pick the files you want to be put out in public, all of that is possible. All of that is not a terribly bad idea, actually. And you'll see a lot of people talk about using a technology called Gulp to go ahead and package all your dependencies up in order to package them for when you're releasing out onto a web server. Again, what you're getting here from ASP.NET is everything is pluggable, everything is overridable, and embracing of pretty much any technology that you want to use. You can opt into all of this sort of very web development, sort of cutting edge way of doing web development that's pretty far from sort of the drag and drop ASP.NET Web Forms world, or you can try to stay into and using a lot of the visual tooling that you want, and that's also fine. So they're trying to appeal to every developer type. Some developers are comfortable with command line tools and just editing files and making it work, and other developers want everything to be configurable through dialogues and such in Visual Studio, and they're trying to make it work for both. If you use Visual Studio Code to do this, it's sort of implying that on the Mac and on Linux, as well as when you use it here on the PC, that you're going to be working with it in a more command line or text file oriented. You're going to see much less of this sort of visual tools like the NuGet and Bower Package Manager UIs to help you. So I think we're at the point, let's go ahead and give ourselves a good 10-15 minutes to answer some questions. So I'm going to give Lindsay back the mic, and she's going to help us proctor some of the questions, and we'll go from there.
Okay, cool. We got a couple questions coming in right now. You want me to read them back to you?
Yeah, because they're coming. Oh, I see where the questions are now. So let me kind of go through the questions here. You don't have to read them back to me. I'll sort of proctor them. I think it's probably the easiest way to do it. So Travis has asked a couple of questions. The first question is Startup a replacement for global.asax? It is emotionally. So Startup is where Startup is happening in the same way that global.asax did, though instead of just handling a couple of events like you did in global.asax, you're going to be more plugging in middleware. So it is the replacement for global.asax. It's just done in a different, pretty much a more scalable way than just handling these handful of global events. Another question that was asked also by Travis is the developer exception page configurable in a configuration file, or is it only compiled in code? So the developer exception page is configurable by config, but that is configuration that you're going to actually set up. So the ASP.NET 5 has this notion of of deployments. which I didn't have time to show, but where you can find out whether you're in on a developer machine, in staging, in production, and so you can switch those based on those pieces. You'll see that in the default template, and then of course I talk about that in my course on how to do that as well. And let me get to some other people's questions, and I'll get back to a couple of Travis's. Eric Santos asks, what if I'm not getting IntelliSense inside the Bower file? Are you missing something? If you're not getting IntelliSense in the Bower, you may not have the latest version of the Visual Studio update that is installed, or there might just be a bug, to be perfectly honest with you, because I have seen that happen occasionally. Restarting Visual Studio, sometimes a reboot will solve that, but we are in sort of the RC phase. Make sure that if you're working with ASP.NET 5 that you go and get the newest version of the runtime as well as the Visual Studio extensions. And you can do that by going to https://get.asp.net. That's the entire address, get.asp.net. Jan asked, is the Bower JSON is hidden in the system or just in the Visual Studio Solution Explorer? Just in the Visual Studio Solution Explorer. Now that the RC has started to hide it as well as the other JSON files, the first thing I do with a new project is I go and unhide them from the project because I want access to them. But that was a decision Microsoft made. Kareem asks, for Windows C# developers, why don't you work in who don't work in non-Windows platforms? Can you still just add jQuery using NuGet rather than Bower? Bower seems duplicative. No, you can't, and one of the reasons is that the way that NuGet works on ASP.NET currently doesn't know about the new structures of ASP.NET. So instead of extending NuGet to know about the different kinds of platforms, they decided to embrace what everyone else is doing, and that is using NuGet or NPM or JSPM in order to handle these packages. The way that NuGet works and the way the other package managers work are a bit different, and so they didn't want to just reinvent and have one more package management for a client. So it is something I would get used to. You're going to see in Visual Studio, if you go to NuGet and try to include jQuery, that they're going to say this isn't supported on this platform, and they'll actually have a link over to the Bower stuff. So they're trying to help sort of handhold you to the new world as well. Anther asks, is web.config gone, or how do I add some external dependencies that I may not want in the project.json format? So web.config is essentially gone. You're going to see it show up in a couple of places where IIS still needs it, but the new configuration system, which I didn't have time to show, is a completely pluggable one. So it's configuration allows you to mix and match configuration from a bunch of different sources. You can have it in JSON files and XML files, INI files, reading from environment variables, and so you're given a lot more control over how that happens, where you would get that. So you can now have configuration anywhere you really need configuration. Out of the box, again, it reads JSON files, XML files, INI files, environment variables, and I think there might be a couple other formats that I'm forgetting. But so that you can sort of mix and match and in fact have a configuration file in your application that does these things and then even override them in things like environment variables so that you can make those decisions when you do things like cloud deployments. I have a lot of questions, so let's keep on moving. Yasemin asks, is Bower RC added automatically when you create your app, or do you have to add it manually? Currently, if you start the brand new full project template, it's included by default. And if you add just the Bower file to an empty project like I did, it was also added by default. So it's putting in that Bower RC file automatically for you. You can get rid of it if that's not what you want, but that is what it's doing currently. Nicholas Carson asks, if you have a class library from another solution, is it necessary to make that class library a NuGet package? And if so, can you do it? No, you do not have to make a class library from another solution you can make a direct reference to from ASP.NET 5 to a .NET assembly directly. You could also wrap it in an xproj file, which makes it a little easier to make a reference to, but you can make direct references. In fact, the add references dialog continues to work the way it always has. You can say browse, and then the only difference is that it throws that reference into your project JSON for you. The same experience of adding a reference to an actual just C# DLL works in the same way. So Jeremy Cook asks many questions. Let me try to answer a couple of his, and then we'll get to some other people. Jeremy, what does sending mail via SMTP look like in DNX Core? Ooh, that's a tougher question, because so the question revolves around that DNX Core hasn't included system.net, which is what most of us use to send emails. There are a number of open source libraries that do this already. A lot of people are sort of getting out of the business of sending mail and using things like SendGrid and other things. There's a number of options, but they're all open source, and Microsoft isn't supplying one. So another question he asks is recommended alternative to web.config transforms in lieu of their absence. So the recommendation there around transforming your web.config when you go to release and such is actually overriding them. So the way that configuration works now is as you have a number of configurations, the ones lower down on the list override the ones upper on the list. And so what you would do is include configuration files or environment variables on your production and testing and staging machines that override what you have in development. And he has got a lot of questions. I'm going to get to someone else's, and then I'll get back if we have time to some more questions by the same people. Lucas asked, does Visual Studio prettify Bower components folder structure, or is it changed in ASP.NET? So when you're using Bower, by default, that Bower RC file changes the location of where the Bower component is created, but Visual Studio does nothing except for what Bower does. So all that Bower does is throw the Bower components in whatever folder is in that Bower RC unmolested. So you'll see that in a lot of examples out there of people using the Bower components folder and then using something like a gulp or a grunt script to cherry pick which components are then put in www root. And that's the route that a lot of people prefer, and ASP.NET 5 certainly allows for that pattern. You do not have to choose the one that's built in. They just wanted to use the direct dropping of the Bower components in the www root so that people coming to the platform new had to learn as few of the new ideas to just get up to speed. Here's a long question. We have probably time for 2 or 3 more. Shawn mentioned cross-platform support. So is there smooth interoperability between Visual Studio Code and Visual Studio and the full Visual Studio? Yes, you can start a project in one and open it in another, back and forth. Visual Studio Code is really just showing you the project structure. And the way that ASP.NET 5 deals with project structure is, with the exception of the Bower and NPM configuration files, any file in that folder structure is automatically part of the project. You don't have the old pattern of having to add a file to be included in a project magically with a right click. Vincent asks, assuming you have a layered architecture, and that's a very long question. Let me see if I can get to the heart of it. How does one configure the IOC container? Can you move your IOC container services out of configure services? So if you have multiple layers here, you can have the configure services call whatever you want to actually do the configuration. It doesn't have to be in that method. It just has to be called from within that method, which is how you would plug yours in. And let me get to one last question because we're running out of time. Here's Rod McBride asked the tough question. Is there an upgrade path from MVC 4 to MVC 5? And I think he means ASP.NET 4 to 5 or MVC 5 to 6. So I'm going to answer that question instead of the MVC 4 to 5, which there is an upgrade path for. So to go from today's MVC 5 to ASP.NET 5's MVC 6, which I know the numbering is confusing, but to go to this new platform, there is an upgrade path, but it's not a open my project and make it upgrade path. There's going to be a list of steps to move to this. In fact, there's a blog post by, I will include it in my blog post when I talk about this. Someone has actually done this, convert one to the other, and shown all the steps involved, and it is quite involved. So it isn't going to be an automatic process at all. What I think a lot of people envision is that if you've got an investment in ASP.NET 4 and MVC 5, that this would maybe be a better candidate for greenfield or brand new projects than trying to move all your stuff. They are supporting and finding ways to handle interoperability between sort of the coexistence of both. But because of the cross-platform support nature of what they're trying to do, some things just aren't going to work. You're going to have pain points to doing some things that you're used to doing that are going to be harder in the new platform at first as we're starting to evolve the .NET Core. A common pain point that people come up into is when they're trying to use .NET Core and they're used to using system.drawing in order to manipulate images, they need to find an alternative to system.drawing that works well on non-Microsoft platforms, and system.drawing is so tied to GDI. I think that's all the questions we have time for. I think we wanted to wrap it up with a couple of slides.
Yeah, unfortunately, we had so many questions come through that we just can't possibly get to all of them, but I would encourage everyone to check out the discussion forums on pluralsight.com or continue the conversation on Twitter as well. Shawn, did you have anything else you wanted to say before we wrapped up?
I want to thank everyone for coming. It was great to be able to present some of this to you. Of course, this is sort of an abbreviated version of the course that's on Pluralsight, so if you want to learn more, that's obviously a good place to start.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Shawn. Thank you, everyone, for participating today. Again, we apologize we didn't have time to get to everyone's questions. Continue the conversation again on Twitter and tag your comments and questions with Pluralsight Live. If you have additional questions about webinars or questions or ideas for topics that you'd like to see us cover, please feel free to email us at webinars@pluralsight.com. And before you go, please fill out our short survey. We'd really love to hear your thoughts. And thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.